So my contact information is on that slide. If you want to email me, feel free to. So we did a webinar several months ago about the telecom AI market opportunity. The session today is going to be a continuation of that. It's going to be fleshed out a little bit more, and it's going to be a little bit more forward-looking, what to expect, and some of the things that we've seen happen since the last webinar. Before we jump into the content, I want to go over real quick the telecom research coverage and an overview of the report that this webinar is based off of. So at TBR, I represent the telecom practice. So we have approximately 27 differentiated reports about the telecom industry, spanning benchmarks, market forecasts, market landscapes, vendor and operator reports. These come out on a quarterly, semi-annual, or annual basis, depending on the report. Today, we're focusing on that report that's in green, which is our telecom AI market landscape. And essentially, that report covers how the telecom industry as a whole, but with emphasis on the major players in that, so the CSPs, the network vendors, and then the hyperscalers, and how those entity groups in the ecosystem are participating in the AI opportunity. We look at AI models, we look at use cases, we look at the business outcomes to expect. Those are the types of content that we're looking at in that report. And what I'm going to be sharing today is a derivative of that broader report. Some of the folks on this call have access to the full report. If you want to know how to get access to that, feel free to email Haley or myself, and we can help you do that. You can also email the sales representative from TBR that your company is associated with. Okay, so for today's agenda, we're going to start off by defining AI. And so we're all on the same page with what we're talking about. I'm going to give a market status update. We're going to then move into this hype versus reality situation, kind of where the telecom industry is really at with commercialization, experimentation with AI. Then we're going to look at AI models. We're going to look at outcomes, so business outcomes to be expected, some of the outcomes telcos are realizing today from the use of AI, then key takeaways, and then we'll have Q&A at the very end. So first off with taxonomy and definition. So AI is not new. GenAI is new. So I'm reiterating this from the prior webinar. I want to make a clear distinction between traditional AI and generative AI. These are two separate types of AI. And the reason they're different is because of the types of data that they utilize to do inferencing. So for traditional AI, these models use structured data, which is manually put together. It's cleaned, it's labeled data. It's more manual intensive to get the model set up, to get the data ingressed into those models. But once it's set up, it usually is dynamic enough to do one or a few tasks. And this type of AI has been used by the telecom industry for at least the last 10 years. The earliest uses of this type of AI was in the 2012 timeframe, where we started to see vendors and operators utilizing this in their NOCs. So their network operation centers, and also for security operations, threat detection, those types of things. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Generative AI is the new stuff. This is the stuff that came on the scene in the last 2 years. Generative AI is much more important than traditional AI because of the scope is far greater. So when I say scope, the types of data that these models can use is far greater, and it can be unstructured. Unstructured data is what most data is today. So in an enterprise environment, a very small portion of an enterprise's full data lake is actually structured. The vast majority is unstructured. And unstructured data can include things like pictures, videos, documents, social media feedback, text messages, handwritten words, so handwritten notes that might be scanned and residing as a PDF in a corporate system. These are all types of unstructured data that these generative AI models can go into and do training and inferencing off of that. That's a game changer. That's why the AI has become so hyped now, because of the potential that this holds. We're going to be focusing on generative AI for the discussion today, but I do also want to make it known that some of this content is specific to traditional AI, and some of it is broader to encompass both types of AI. And I'll try to point that out where it's relevant. So, market update. So I want to talk about timeline to transformation. So we do expect that GenAI is going to have broad impact across not only the telecom industry, but all industries, as well as consumers' lives. It's going to change a lot. Ultimately is the key word. This stuff is going to move much slower than people think it will. And it's just going to take time. And I want to contextualize this a bit. Currently, the technology for generative AI is immature. If we go into the past, 2012 to 2022, this is the traditional AI era. This is where we saw the telecom industry beginning to employ traditional AI in select use cases. And most of the outcomes they realized pertain to cost reduction. So removing manual processes in network operations, removing manual processes in threat detection in the security layer. These are things that where it was utilized. Fraud detection would be another key use case. The present is where we're at right now. The generative AI is taking off, but this is currently in the learning phase. There's not much inferencing going on. If we look at the totality of Gen AI today, the vast majority of what's happening is model training. This is the mega data centers the hyperscalers are building and ingressing data as much as they can possibly get their hands on. And they're training those models as fast as they possibly can. This is where we're currently at. Not too much by way of outcomes yet. So the inferencing stage, we're not really there yet. It hasn't really started in a big way yet. Where it's really going to start is next year. We're really going to start to see inferencing taking off, where AI models have been trained to a level where they're able to bring business outcomes to the customers with a high degree of accuracy. Accuracy is another key word, because some of these models, yeah, you can run them and they will give outputs, but what's the quality and the efficacy of those outputs? Do those outputs provide an outcome that is measurable and that is actually usable by the end customer? And that's really where the immaturity of the technology is right now. It's going to take time. It's going to take time for this stuff to play out. And that's where I come in. I came up with the headline for this webinar of the gap between the hype and the reality. The reality is the industry is very immature right now. There's a lot of challenges that not many people are talking about that could dramatically slow the pace of model training, the pace of shifting that to inferencing, and the shift to getting actual outcomes from that. Those challenges, we're starting to hear more and more about these challenges in the news. I'm going to talk about some of them in upcoming slides, so let's put a pin in that for now. In the future, we're going to see a shift from emphasis on training to emphasis on inferencing. We're going to see leading CSPs start to realize substantial outcomes from use of these models. We're expecting that to be the second half of this decade, so starting next year through the end of this decade. Cost reduction across multiple domains of a telco's business. In the 2030s, we're expecting that's when we're going to start to see cross-domain, closed-loop automation at scale, okay? That's when the AI is at a level of maturity where telcos are really transforming. This is not just about point solutions that are getting a quick hit outcome. This is about fundamental re-architecting of the business structure, how the network is structured within a telco. That stuff is really, that's far out from now. That's really a next decade type of thing. And that's, I think, part of this hype versus the reality. How long is it really going to take to get those that transformational outcome for the industry? And we're putting that on, we're at least 5 years out from seeing something like that in the market. We've got a ways to go. So things to keep in mind here. The industry has been using AI since the early 2010s. This is not new. Generative AI is early days. We are expecting significant business outcomes over a period of time for the telecom industry. And lastly here, we need to keep in mind that telcos move slowly. If we look at history, telcos move slowly. They move relatively slower than how fast other industries move. There's a variety of reasons for that. We do not expect a change with AI. We expect the outcome to be the same. They're gonna move slower than most other verticals. So we need to keep that in mind as well for timelines. There's regulatory reasons for that. There's there's a need for uptime, 5.9 reliability. There's a need for conservatism to make sure that there's resiliency and redundancy and in the network, so that if something goes wrong in a model, if there's a bad outcome, it doesn't take down the whole network, or it doesn't create a situation where there's a cybersecurity situation. Like these are big challenges. These are some of the reasons why telcos are going to move slower relative to some other industries. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about hype versus reality, and we need to consider some things. These are things that some people must consider that I just not seeing it being talked about enough. We are seeing key vendors in the telecom ecosystem that have historically been big players. We have been seeing them gradually deprioritizing the telecom industry. Deprioritization. Cisco, Nokia, and Intel are the three that come to mind immediately. There are others. Okay, this is a trend. And what we mean by this is, if you take Cisco as an example, if you look at Cisco's revenue contribution by customer segment 10 years ago, and you compare it to today, it looks very different. The portion of their revenue related to telco is much lower than it was even just 10 years ago. Nokia, if you look at their contribution of telco to their total revenue, it's much lower than it was even just 5 years ago, right? We have enterprise and hyperscale make up a much larger portion of their revenue today. Intel is another one. Intel, as we know, is struggling in the market. They have to do a big restructuring. Part of their restructuring is a de-emphasis on the telecom industry. This is part of the broader restructuring program. This is something that is a trend. It's not specific to just these three companies. These are just examples. And this could very well stifle how fast the telecom industry can move to leverage AI in their ecosystem. We're seeing experimentation, and we're seeing a desire for quote unquote quick hits rather than transformational solutions leveraging AI. We are not seeing many telcos looking for big picture transformations here. What we're seeing them doing, they're allocating smaller budgets to find quick hit ways they can get a quick outcome from using AI. So more tactical, surgical type use cases versus full domain or cross domain types of use cases. That needs to be kept in mind. We're not seeing telco budgets dramatically increasing because they need to allocate money to AI. It's not happening. It is not happening. The other thing we need to keep in mind is that when telcos discuss the number of use cases they're using for AI, they are typically including traditional AI in those numbers. It is not just Gen AI. So AT&T is one of the examples. They have publicly stated that they're using, I forget the exact number, but it's over 100 use cases for AI today. That's what they're saying. And that number must include traditional AI. It doesn't make, there's no way that they've gotten to over 100 use cases in that very short time frame for just Gen AI. It just doesn't make sense. We do know that they have been using traditional AI across a variety of use cases for a number of years now. So just keep that in mind. When you hear numbers thrown out, you have to contextualize it. It is highly likely that those numbers, they're including all forms of AI, not specifically generative AI. So that needs to be kept in mind. The next thing that we need to talk about is, are people really using this stuff in the workplace? Are they using this in their day-to-day lives? People are dabbling, we see that. We see some experimentation. We see work groups that are going out to the side and doing experiments and testing things like code development, for example. But when we look for commercialization, embedment into processes in the actual business from a generative AI perspective, we're not seeing much of this. We see a little bit in call center. We see some in OSS, BSS. Once we go beyond that, we don't see a whole lot. There's a little bit going on in administrative functions like document management, searching documents for corporate documentation, legal, financial documents, those types of things, procurement documents, things of that nature. But beyond those things, we don't really see much from a generative AI standpoint. And where it is being used, it's relatively limited. There is a degree of caution here around the efficacy of the outputs that are coming in. There's also an element of people are scared for their jobs. Like, some people literally are nervous to use these things because they're very nervous about what that means for their future. Bloomberg actually did an article last week on this mindset among the worker base. Very fascinating article. It was specific to the call centers, and they did some excellent reporting on this. Highly recommend going to read that report. It's on the Bloomberg website. And it talks about this dynamic in the workforce. It's kind of an unspoken of thing, but this is a very real dynamic that companies are having to deal with, this cultural maybe resistance to adopting these new technologies. So that's something that needs to be kept in mind here. This can really stifle evangelization of this technology across an organization. The other thing, and this is building on the prior bullet, is the FUD around it. AI can also be viewed as a distraction. You get a widget that comes up on your screen and it starts to talk to you, and it's blinking at you on your dashboard, and it wants you to write something on it. And is this helping or hurting productivity? That's a big question mark. This is something that needs to be considered. Is AI actually bringing a benefit? And I would argue as an industry, there's still an immaturity around this. I do firmly believe that there will be productivity enhancement, a lot of it. But at this stage in the game, that needs to be figured out. How do you balance the distraction elements of it with the utilization of it for productive use? That balancing game, that has to be calibrated appropriately. Right now, I would say it's misaligned. The other two things is compliance concerns around data and privacy, and then the liability. What kind of legal exposure does an organization have outside, so extra-organization and intra-organization exposure do they have from the use of AI? And this is something the management consultancies are helping with this. This is one of the top things they're being asked about to help companies get their heads around this. Risk mitigation, right? How do we implement AI without creating unforeseen risks in our business? So this must be kept in mind. Another thing is that CSPs are likely to remain tech consumers rather than technology producers. And what I mean by that is the telcos are beholden to innovation producers for AI. This limits their revenue generation opportunities and it mitigates competitive differentiation. So basically what I mean by this is the telcos aren't creating their own AI. They might be dabbling with their own models for their own specific use cases. But when you look at who owns the models, who owns the foundational infrastructure that enables those models, enables those outcomes for companies, in the vast majority of cases, the telco is not in that value chain. That makes them a consumer of what other companies are producing. And that puts telcos at a competitive disadvantage for how do they generate revenue from this technology? How do they get an outside share of economic profits and the broader value that's generated from AI? What it looks like is that AI is going to be another example where telcos are going to, yes, they're going to get a benefit from the technology, absolutely, but it's going to be a cost of doing business. They're going to be under pressure to invest in this technology to stay competitive with other companies that are also participating in existing value chains from existing providers of that enablement infrastructure. That needs to be kept in mind. It's very important. And lastly here, regulatory clarity. The governments are on the back foot here. AI is moving so quickly. The governments cannot get their heads around this. Regulation is, we don't know what this is going to look like. There's a lot of questions. This could be a big impediment to market development. This is going to slow things down. It's going to slow it down. All of the bullets here are going to slow this down. So we need to keep this in mind. This is not going to move as fast as everybody thinks it is. Don't just look at what the hyperscalers are doing with their CapEx investments in AI enablement infrastructure. You have to look at, on the customer side, how fast is this actually going to go from training to inferencing and from inferencing to outcomes, where you get an economic benefit from that outcome. And that timeline is going to be stretched. Okay, so very quickly on AI models. So this is going to be an example of the hierarchy for AI models. And specifically here, we're talking about LLMs. So we have a pyramid here, and at the base of the pyramid, we have the foundational AI models. So these are examples of LLMs that are broadly utilized. These are some of the largest LLMs in the world: ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini. So you've got Microsoft, Amazon, and Google there represented. Those are their, those are the entities they've aligned with. Then you're going to have, on top of those foundational models, you're going to have telecom industry-specific models where either these models are optimized to address a specific domain, like maybe call center, or a specific use case. We've also seen some vendors creating their own LLMs for this purpose, like Amdocs, which has the Amaze platform. So that is leveraged for things like, specific to the OSS BSS domain, as an example of that. And then on the top of the pyramid, we have use case specific AI model customizations. So you get the industry specific, maybe data that's optimized, the models are trained and optimized specific for telecom industry use. Then you're getting specific use cases that are optimized on top of that. This is where you're getting really honed down, outcome-based AI models that are going to bring an outcome to the customer, to the telco. And these are going to be optimized to run telco-specific workloads, and they're going to enable telcos and customers as well. That's a key point to keep in mind as well. It's not just about optimizing the telco, it's also about the telco passing through those innovations to their end customers to enable their end customers, like SMBs as an example. So these are just, those text boxes are just talking about what I just talked about with the pyramid. So moving forward here, on the foundational AI models, I have a list here of the largest models. And one key takeaway here, I want to stress this, when I say that the telcos are not technology producers, they're the consumers of it. Almost all of these models here, almost all of the largest LLMs in the world by number of parameters, just the scale and scope of it, the size of their data lake that they're using. The majority of these are either directly or indirectly controlled or influenced by a hyperscaler. Okay, and I tried to list the key ones there, who's backing what. And you can see this clearly. So the hyperscalers are very much in the driver's seat of the AI enabling infrastructure to enable the telecom industry with outcomes. But the economic value, the revenue generation opportunity that comes from these enablement technologies, the vast majority of that is going to accrue to the technology producers, which in this case, a high degree of that is going to go to the hyperscalers. This is a huge multi-hundred billion revenue opportunity for the hyperscalers, and they're salivating over this. I want to talk about outcomes. So just building on this theme, when we look at new revenue, there are a few areas where we think telcos will make money from AI. One is revenue protection. So if you have a call center that's optimized to bring better outcomes from when customers call in, you might get situations where you can prevent churn, where you can upsell, maybe cross-sell a customer. That would be revenue protection, and there might be some upsell in there. GPU as a service is something that telcos could sell to their end customers, maybe enable their SMB customers, potentially large enterprises and government customers, that's potential. And then reselling vendor solutions. So maybe the telcos are a channel of the hyperscalers to the end user, or a channel from a network vendor like a Cisco that is selling something through their channel to their end customers. Telcos might be able to play a role there to generate revenue. And that's what I just said there in those bullets. Outcomes on the cost reduction side, this is really about making the workforce more productive, optimizing the workforce, and energy optimization. These are three areas. These are not comprehensive lists here, but these are ways to think about how the AI, the types of outcomes to expect from AI. So what we have here is a chart of relative magnitude of job impact from AI by domain. And this is a proxy for ascertaining where is the relatively least and relative most transformation going to occur from AI, from a telco perspective. And we did this from a domain standpoint. So customer care would be like the contact center domain, which we identify as being the most transformed from the generative AI technology. And then the least impacted would be on the network construction side. That's still going to remain very manual intensive. You can't really automate and get too much of that out of the equation because of the nature of it. It is more manual intensive, labor intensive type work. So the key points here, there's numerous opportunities for telcos to reduce costs using AI and GenAI. The bulk of the cost reduction is going to pertain to labor, and it's going to stem from either job augmentation, which is making existing workers more productive, and job redundancies, where we may see rationalization, or we may see attrition without rehiring. This is something that I think is happening now, where in the call center, and you, again, go to that Bloomberg article if you want to see this, like this is what's happening now, where if in the call center environments, if people are leaving on their own accord, maybe they're leaving for another job or something, the call center operator is choosing not to refill that position. And they're letting a natural attrition lower their total headcount in the call center. This is something that we're expecting many companies to employ, rather than doing large-scale layoffs in those types of areas. And the augmentation piece has to be factored in as well, because existing workers, if a company can get X amount more productivity out of one worker using AI, that's like a win-win actually for the situation, because the company is getting an enhanced outcome, and AI is not going to be able to do everything. You are still going to need people in the call center, and if you can equip your best people to be even better, you're maximizing those outcomes that we talked about before, things like upsell opportunities, reducing churn, those types of things. And then that last bullet is just talking about the diagram. I already talked about that. So key takeaways, and then we'll go into questions. So generative AI is going to bring significant cost reduction to CSPs. And you can also think about productivity enhancement as a way of cost reduction, in a way. At least that's how we're thinking about it. But in the big picture is there is this gap between the hype and reality. We have to extend those timelines out. It's going to take time for these things to play out. Telcos move slow as an industry. Standards take time. How the data and the privacy and the compliance and the regulation shake out, that's going to take time. Foundational LLMs are going to be leveraged to build those customized, more domain-specific LLMs, which may then lead to more fine-tuning into specific use case optimized AI models, which could be an LLM or something else. We're expecting cost savings to be the primary outcome for telcos from generative AI. And then AI is going to be foundational for CSP digital transformation. We're not expecting significant competitive differentiation for the reasons we specified before about who's producing the technology versus who's consuming it and how that impacts the competitive dynamics in the ecosystem. So with that, we're going to open it up for Q&A. And again, if anybody has a question, add it to the Q&A box. And I think Haley said there's a widget where you can press a button and type in your question. Haley, I see one question there right now. What do you think represents the biggest opportunity for telcos to generate revenue from generative AI? So the biggest opportunity, if I go back to that slide, so the biggest opportunity of these four, so the telcos have already done a pretty good job reducing churn. In fact, churn levels are at the lowest levels they've been, I think, ever in some markets. Like in the US, churn levels are very, very low already. So yes, you'll get some incremental, maybe you can get them even lower by leveraging generative AI. But I actually think reselling vendor solutions is going to be the bigger revenue opportunity. And telcos already are a major channel partner to companies like Cisco, Nokia, Ericsson, if you think about private networks, and a whole range of UC and C providers and other types of companies. Telcos are already, doing a lot of resell and playing a role as a channel partner. So I could see AI. I could see them generating significant revenue from that. But that's revenue, but how profitable is that revenue? If they're a pass-through to get to the end customer, ultimately, you have to think about, contribution to the bottom line and how that might factor into decision-making and how attractive an opportunity might look. So just keep that in mind. Okay, question would be, how does the telco industry prepare for adopting responsible AI, responsible being in quotation marks? So responsible AI, I think, so you have to think about, I think the governments are going to play a key role in that's a really tough question, because you have this technology that is so transformational, has the potential to be so transformational that you're going to have negative externalities from that. You're going to have situations at large scale where society is impacted, but there's a risk of not doing it, but there's also an opportunity of doing it. Because maybe if you have structural changes in an economy, that might enable that economy to actually do more for the greater good if you look at it in a total scope perspective. So for example, if you can free up large portions of the workforce, maybe to do other types of jobs that are maybe in very desperately needed jobs where they really need labor still, things that might not be disrupted as much by AI, that might create an opportunity for an economy to readjust itself to the needs of what the market needs are. Governments, I think, are going to try. They're going to attempt to meddle there and try and steer things in a way where it's limiting the negative impacts of the changes while emphasizing the positive aspects of the changes. Governments have a mixed history of being successful with that, but I think they're going to make attempts there, and that needs to be considered. Also, I think companies have a responsibility for compliance with the regulations and the data privacy and those things, and there is a level of trust here, right? So companies are going to be motivated to retain trust with their end customers, and as part of that, maintaining trust, and again, I'm talking about in the context of data, how data is used in the AI value chain. That's going to force responsible use, responsible practices, and building structures where there's checks and balances to ensure there's responsible utilization of AI. So I think there's going to be the government's going to play a role in balancing that, and I also think companies have an incentive to balance that and set up their own internal processes and structures to have responsible AI because it's good business. It makes good business sense to do that because it will build trust with their customers and it'll help them both to have better outcomes. That's extremely important to maintain that level of trust. So I would think about it in that way in terms of responsible use of AI. Okay, the next question is, how does the telco reconcile the fact that the major LLMs are on the cloud and there are significant concerns on data sharing and privacy? Yeah, so again, coming back to the prior question, I think that the governments are going to play a role here. On that list, I'm actually going to go back to that slide. There are some other entities to keep in mind here. So you have entities like Mistral. I think there's Falcon. They're listed there. There's a few others that are more sovereign-oriented LLMs where the public sector might be involved, or an academic consortium, which is more of a neutral player that's involved. You also have some companies like Meta Platforms, which is taking a more open source-based approach to their LLM. These are things that could mitigate some of the dependencies on some of the other players. And as well as maybe there's structures put in place there where data sharing and privacy are, they might have more robust structures in place to manage those things. I'd be looking for that. But I think places like Europe where you have GDPR and other regulations in place that might hinder development of the AI opportunity, there is incentives for Europe to participate because AI has a lot of potential for good, for new jobs, for high income jobs, for technology breakthroughs. Think about pharmaceuticals. Think about banking and think about cybersecurity, threat mitigation, things like that. There's incentives for Europe to, as an example, to ensure that AI is widely utilized. But there's also a big push there to have, to build frameworks where it's more focused on addressing the privacy and the data sharing aspect. So we'll see how that plays out. Again, this plays into the fact that these things are going to move slower in terms of market development and the pacing of that. But I would be looking to public sector and maybe these open source or academic oriented entities, AI models that might have some breakthroughs there and have really good models in place to address those concerns.